What happened to holiday whimsy? Christmas is supposed to be the most wonderful time of the year, a season of joy, generosity, and togetherness. But over the last 2 centuries, Christmas in the United States has gone from a tradition that helped immigrants feel at home in a foreign land to a billion-dollar industry shaped by advertisers, Hollywood, and most recently, social media. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at how Christmas aesthetics have evolved in the United States over the years, from the whimsical Gilded Age, to the DIY decorations of the Great Depression, to the sad beige Kardashian Christmases of the 2010s. Let's get into it. Although midwinter celebrations have been going on around the world for thousands of years, the version of Christmas we recognize today with twinkly lights, decked out trees, and flying reindeer is actually a more modern invention. And in its earliest days, the holiday wasn't very popular in the United States at all. It was first banned in several colonies by the Pilgrims, who saw it as frivolous and corrupt, and it was later deemed unpatriotic during the American Revolution because of its associations with the British. It wasn't until the 1800s that the holiday began to re-emerge thanks to the millions of people immigrating to the United States at the time, who brought with them their own winter customs and celebrations. But even then, Christmas wasn't seen as American. It was considered a folksy tradition practiced mostly by newcomers who hadn't assimilated yet. That perception changed dramatically during the reign of Queen Victoria. When she assumed the throne in 1837, she sought to improve the British royal family's negative reputation, and she did so through a surprisingly modern PR strategy. Besides appearing in public far more frequently than her predecessors, she also provided insight into her private life, making the monarchy appear far more relatable than it ever had before. Her fairy tale marriage and picture-perfect family, combined with her royal status, made her a bona fide celebrity, and anything that she was said to be fond of was soon adopted by others. Decorating Christmas trees had been a popular custom in Germany for centuries, and Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, was deeply attached to his homeland, so their children grew up celebrating the holidays in the same manner he did. In 1848, an image was printed of the family gathered around a Christmas tree, which went viral for the time, both in England and the United States, and with that, Christmas was given the royal stamp of approval. Members of the nouveau riche immediately adopted Christmas customs, using it to signal taste, refinement, and cultural sophistication, and as always, trends trickled down. In 1853, President Franklin Pierce introduced the first official White House Christmas tree, and in 1870, Christmas Day was declared a federal holiday in the United States, finally giving the tradition national legitimacy. With a guaranteed day off work, it was ensured that people would make a point of celebrating in one way or another. And by the late 1800s, Christmas had become a time of merriment defined by caroling, decorating, gift-giving, and feasting. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution was reshaping how society functioned, and the newly formed middle class was eager to participate in the era's consumer-driven economy. Retailers quickly realized Christmas could be a goldmine, and holiday-specific advertising took off, with Christmas being positioned as both a sentimental family event and as an occasion to shop. They began producing an assortment of knickknacks and baubles to capitalize on the hype surrounding the holiday, like tree stands, glass ornaments, tinsel garlands, and eventually, electric lights. While upper and middle class families embraced these shiny new goods, handmade decorations like stringed popcorn, dried oranges, paper chains, and ribbons continued to make their way onto people's Christmas trees. Because it was the only time of year that every member of the family could be together, everyone took part in decorating for the holidays, solidifying the association between Christmas and camaraderie. As technology advanced in the early 20th century, so did Christmas celebrations. Mass manufacturing made everything about the holiday more affordable and accessible, and by the 1920s, Christmas was fully embedded into American culture. But the arrival of the Great Depression brought these festivities to a screeching halt. Economic hardships forced people to get creative, and handmade items like wooden toys, knitted sweaters, and paper ornaments became the new norm. Despite their limited means, Christmas helped keep spirits high throughout the 1930s, and people pooled resources, shared meals, and created new traditions, emphasizing how your community can also be your family. The significance of Christmas as a joyful escape was reiterated in 1931 when the Rockefeller Center erected their first public Christmas tree. It was a far cry from the spectacle it is today, just a humble fir decorated with whatever they had on hand. But that wasn't too far off from what people of the Depression era had at home, and the tree represented American resilience that would later evolve into one of the nation's most iconic holiday symbols. Department stores like Macy's, Wanamaker's, Robertson's, and Marshall Field's recognized the holiday's emotional importance and created elaborate window displays that were equal parts magic and materialism. They weren't just selling toys, but the feeling of Christmas itself. And even if most visitors couldn't afford the items behind the glass, for at least a moment, they could pretend they could. Back when the holiday was first getting off the ground, Christmas lacked a central figure that brands could use in their marketing. Obviously, there was the birth of Jesus, but using a religious figure to advertise perfume didn't really sit well with people. So instead, figures from European folklore like Father Christmas, Kris Kringle, and Saint Nick appeared in holiday imagery instead. Eventually, this spun off into the creation of the distinctly American Santa Claus, but he too lacked a distinctive visual identity in those early days, sometimes being depicted as a tiny elf and other times as a bishop. The version of Santa Claus we recognize globally is attributed to political cartoonist Thomas Nast, who drew several plump, bearded men wearing a red suit for Harper's Weekly in the 1860s. That imagery persisted over the years, but it was Coca-Cola's 1930s Christmas campaigns that cemented this version of Santa in the American imagination. The company depicted him as a jolly old man who wasn't afraid to indulge, traits that deeply resonated with consumers during the Great Depression. And the success of the campaign inspired other brands to dress up their Santas in a similar fashion. And now, he's probably the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Christmas. Just when things were starting to look up, the United States entered World War II, and nearly every category of consumer goods was impacted. Rationing meant that foods that were typically eaten around Christmas time, like candy canes, hot cocoa, and roast turkey, were difficult to come by. Meanwhile, the factories that had once produced ornaments, tinsel, and Christmas lights were now wholly devoted to the war effort. Once again, families reverted to a more modest Christmas aesthetic made out of repurposed materials, and it was constantly reiterated that these sacrifices were for the good of the entire country. With millions of young men unable to come home for the holidays, continuing to celebrate Christmas, even in a minimized fashion, was seen as a way of honoring the American way of life that they were fighting so hard to protect. At the end of the war, the United States entered a period of economic growth and cultural optimism, and once mass manufacturing resumed, holiday goods returned to store shelves with a vengeance. Almost every aspect of pop culture presented Christmas as the most wonderful time of the year, and the frugality of the wartime era was quickly replaced with rampant consumerism. Department stores made their displays even bigger, radio stations played holiday songs on repeat, and Hollywood presented a standardized image of the holiday. Stockings were filled to the brim with candy canes, carolers walked arm in arm through snowy streets, and giant Christmas trees loomed over perfectly wrapped presents. This encouraged families to move away from the rustic decor associated with times of hardship and towards a glossy and glamorous look that signaled to others that you were celebrating the holidays the right way. There was a lot more pomp and circumstance involved overall, and people were encouraged to drink, dance, sing, and shop their way through the season. This version of Christmas became symbolic of an idealized American life, one tied to abundance, gratitude, and community, and people would spend decades attempting to replicate it. With magazines, commercials, TV shows, and movies all following the same template for what Christmas should look like, millions of Americans were exposed to the same imagery over and over again. This resulted in the holidays becoming a touch formulaic. But because of the sentimental nature of the season, there were still slight variations from family to family, like their exact wrapping paper, ornaments, or lawn decorations. By the 1980s, the commercialization of Christmas was impossible to ignore, and countless films attempted to remind audiences that the holiday wasn't just about presents and parties, but human connection, a message that was relayed to both parents and children. These films aired annually on television during the holiday season, then later made their way to VHS and DVD, and they helped cement this fictionalized, idealized version of Christmas in the cultural imagination. Because they were staples of people's childhoods, there was a lot of nostalgia surrounding them, and this colorful, chaotic, and cozy version of Christmas is the one most people consider the standard. Christmas decor had been fairly consistent from the 1950s onwards, but when the 2010s arrived, so did a new approach to the holidays. Similar to how Christmas in the 1930s was impacted by the Great Depression, how people celebrated in the 2010s was impacted by the Great Recession. With everyone having less disposable income, the sorts of luxuries associated with Christmas weren't the priority. But unlike past times of hardship, instead of getting crafty, we demanded that things be cheaper. Retailers responded, and while you could buy more for less, they were also of significantly lower quality. Without this longevity, more and more people treated their Christmas decor as temporary, something they could throw away and replace every season. And even after the economy improved, people didn't really think of buying things they could use for years and years. With home ownership on the decline, more and more people celebrated the holidays in apartments, many of which featured the minimalist design styles popularized in the 2010s. Without all of the embellishments and character of the past, these new builds were a lot more cost-effective, but the open floor plans, black hardware, and neutral interiors didn't exactly lend themselves to the cozy vibes of a traditional Christmas. I mean, just look at the recent remodel of the Home Alone house. Not to mention, the average person just didn't have the space for large-scale displays anymore, so they switched to a more minimal holiday setup with monochromatic ornaments and multi-purpose wrapping paper. Social media was also to blame for this shift in visuals, with many influencers perpetuating the idea that a neutral aesthetic was not only modern, but luxurious and sophisticated, whereas clutter and kitsch was outdated, something your mama would do. Before the digital age, the only people who would ever see your Christmas setup were your friends and family, and while that brings with it its own challenges and pressures, that was nothing compared to the judgment of strangers. Eventually, there was this expectation that people should be decorating their homes not for themselves, but for other people and the almighty algorithm. These sad beige Christmases emphasized uniformity, getting rid of the individual histories and family traditions that made the season so special in the first place. It's also interesting to note how the decline in stereotypical Christmas visuals happened to line up with a rise in atheism in the United States. Back in the 1980s, an era that leaned into the most extravagant parts of the holiday, 90% of Americans identified as Christian, but that number has since gone down to just over 60%. Perhaps people felt inclined to distance themselves from the traditional Christmas aesthetic because they weren't drawn to its religious aspects, and didn't want to come across as appropriative. This was also reflected in advertisements at the time, with brands moving away from Merry Christmas sentiments towards Happy Holidays and Season's greetings under the guise of inclusivity and diversity. As the decade closed, signs of neutral fatigue appeared, and after years of scrolling past identical trees and ornaments, many felt that something fundamental was missing from modern Christmas celebrations: coziness and charm.
Why is everybody using these tiny little lights nowadays? I remember when people used to use big lights.
That's a good story, Grandpa.
With the pandemic having an immeasurable impact on how people interact, we've become more desperate for human connection and community than ever before. This brought back a sense of nostalgia for a better time, one where your entire family gathered around the Christmas tree and your friends came over for dinner. With this comforting imagery being a staple of Christmases past, we're seeing a shift towards more messy decor styles that incorporate vintage ornaments, handmade garlands, and sentimental keepsakes. Those same styles might have been considered tacky 10 years ago, but now they're being championed as an authentic expression of individuality. As we know, nostalgia is profitable, but it's also a great distraction. And as we've seen time and time again, in the face of uncertainty, people search for comfort and stability, even if it's fleeting and superficial. And while I'm sure some people are gravitating towards this aesthetic because it reminds them of their childhoods, how much of it is just following the latest trend on TikTok? In this day and age, the more niche something is, the better. And having a one-of-a-kind Christmas tree is a subtle way of signaling to the world that you have the time and means to curate an impressive Christmas collection. It's a form of cultural currency, not just a way to celebrate. With the divide between the average person and the 1% growing even larger, this shift towards a vintage aesthetic says a lot about how people are feeling about capitalism and community at the moment. We don't want the generic Christmas sold to us by billionaires. We want something that has heart and reminds us of what the season stands for, even if that means embracing a bit of cringe. Are you more of a Christmas minimalist or maximalist? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!